Go back to your country. A history of why we can't. Now, before I begin this history of Panama, I feel the need to justify making this video in the first place. You see, my relationship to my Panamanian heritage has always been strained. I was born about 20 years ago in a sleepy little suburb just a short walk away from the Rose Bowl. Despite being so close to Hollywood, my hometown was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone. I love my hometown, boring Goodwills and all, but one thing that I think is kind of critical to understanding my slice of suburbia is that it was almost exclusively white. I grew up right here, actually, in Pasadena, California. Even though I loved my hometown, it was difficult not to feel a bit like an alien. One experience that I feel is not unfamiliar to all frijol en la frente Latinos living in the US is that of discrimination. When I was in elementary school, I had an experience that I now consider to be foundational. I was in about 6th grade, I think, and a young boy came up to me and he asked what I thought at the time was a rather innocent question. He said, "Why don't you go back to your own country?" Even though I'm sure the question was not meant to be taken literally, I think that if I had taken the time to explain why I can't just go back to a country me and my siblings had never actually been to, I think I would be wasting my breath. So I want this video to be an answer to every person who's ever had this question or a similar one. Here it is. Here's why I can't go back to my country. To start at the very beginning, the Isthmus of Panama has an almost unparalleled history of natural biodiversity. Prior to the filling in of the isthmus, North and South America were unconnected by land and had separate ecosystems. As a result of this great American biotic interchange, the isthmus became one of the most important ecological melting points in the whole world. Unprecedented biodiversity fostered one of the healthiest and most sustainable ecosystems in the history of our planet. Evidence of the indigenous peoples of Panama can be traced back tens of thousands of years. They more than likely predate our earliest known evidence of human activity, but most scientists agree that the first inhabitants of Panama began domesticating crops some 11,000 years ago. We know shockingly little about the millions of natives who inhabited Panama prior to European contact and the Columbian exchange. What little we do know comes mostly from Europeans themselves or second or third generation mixed race authors, sometimes writing decades or centuries removed from the events they describe. While the last thing I want to do is gloss over thousands and thousands of years of history, reducing millions of people's lives to a generalized half-truth, for the sake of time, I have to leave it at this. It would be impossible to overstate the impact indigenous peoples of America have had on the development of the 21st century. Indigenous activists and agitators deserve full recognition and credit for their contributions to anti-racist and feminist causes throughout history. To name just one, let us all remember the tireless work of Maria Pantalones. Now, our story truly begins with the Spanish conquest of the Americas. In 1501, Rodrigo de Bastidas became the first European to set foot on the Isthmus of Panama, and within a few short decades, the Spanish crown had recognized the importance of and converged upon the isthmus. The first permanent European settlement in the area was founded by Vasco Núñez de Balboa, the same Balboa for whom the SoCal Island and its famous chocolate-dipped bananas were named after. Even during this period of colonial rule, the transit zone began to take shape and develop as the more urbanized and economically centralized part of Panama. Again, for the sake of time, I'm going to gloss over much of the period of Spanish colonial rule and focus on Panama following its independence from Spain and subsequent incorporation into the new state of Gran Colombia in 1819. By the 1840s, traffic from U.S. prospectors going to the West Coast gold rush had made Panama into an area of great importance internationally. With an eye for future considerations, the U.S. government and the government of New Granada signed their first official treaty, ceding land for a transcontinental railroad, the first in history. This event can be considered one of the first examples in the long history of U.S. exploitation of Panamanian people, land, and resources. Included in the terms of the negotiation, the U.S. agreed to forcefully depose any living on the land that would become the Transcontinental Railroad. In addition, the U.S. agreed to militarily suppress popular progressive movements like that of the Colombian Liberal Party. Characteristically, the railroad did not connect Panamanians to other Panamanians. Like almost all colonial infrastructure, it only existed to extract wealth as quickly and efficiently as possible from the colonized region. 47 miles of railroad connected only Panama City to the purpose-built port city of Colón. It is here again that we must gloss over significant periods of history, including early French canal development. The French wanted to build a canal across Panama for many of the same reasons they would later sponsor the construction of the Suez Canal, their own financial interest. French construction of the canal was plagued with problems from the start, and after 8 long years, the French decided to cut their losses and sell the French Canal Company to U.S. financiers. Now, the U.S. had the monumental task of renegotiating the terms of the construction of the canal. In 1902, following the transfer of the French Canal Company to U.S. hands, Theodore Roosevelt had run into a bit of a roadblock. Negotiating directly with the Colombian government, he had struck a deal for the low price of $10 million and a $250,000 annual payment. The U.S. would buy full sovereignty over the 6-mile-wide canal zone. Congress ratified the agreement in March. However, the Colombian legislature unanimously rejected the proposal. The reasons given included the relatively low sum and lack of U.S. recognition of Colombian sovereignty over the canal. This only set the stage for U.S. intervention in order to protect its financial interests. While Colombia had been no stranger to revolution, formerly Gran Colombia was now reduced to half its original size, it should be clear that this revolution occurred very much, as historians like to say, top down. The revolutionaries' face and leader, a statesman named Manuel Obrador Guerrero, met with Theodore Roosevelt's Secretary of State and was assured that the U.S. would support an independent Panama however it could. U.S. Secretary of State John Hay promised military, financial, and diplomatic support. In exchange for their help, the U.S. simply and innocently wanted to renegotiate the terms of their agreement. One day before the revolution had even officially begun, the USS Nashville arrived in Colón, and without a single shot having been fired, Panama achieved its second independence. Under threats of direct and indirect violence, the U.S. and the new government of Panama signed the Hay-Banao-Varia Treaty, which would go down as one of the most unfair and exploitative treaties in all of Panamanian history. Where the U.S. had once only been given 10 miles, now it was given 10 miles plus whatever land deemed necessary for the construction of the canal. Whereas once the U.S. had only been a partner in the canal, now it was the sole proprietor, and where once the U.S. had only agreed to lease the land for 100 years, now the U.S. owned the canal in perpetuity. The treaty was signed without the consent of a single Panamanian, and it should be clear to anyone watching that the U.S. involved itself in Panama strictly for its own capitalistic greed. Eventually, the U.S. negotiated a payment of $25 million to the government of Colombia for its role in the secession of Panama. Now, the story of actually constructing the canal is one long and fraught with problems. However, in the interest of time, I'm going to have to gloss over. Building the canal cost countless lives, millions of dollars, and nearly a full decade of construction. Let us have but one moment of silence for the thousands of workers who died in cruel and unsafe conditions working on the Panama Canal. Now, our story picks up again in the period following World War II and the global shift away from colonial empires. One of the many places that took back their independence during this time was Egypt, and specifically relevant to our story was the Egyptian nationalization of the Suez Canal. Agitators and activists had always been popular in Panama. However, during the post-war restructuring of dominant colonial empires, their calls for change had drummed up enough support that their message could no longer be ignored by those in charge. In 1958, they launched Operation Sovereignty, planting the Panamanian flag in the Canal Zone and petitioning the government for more schools and better social services. By 1959, revolutionaries had launched a full-on revolt at Cerro Tute, inspired by and given assistance by the Cuban revolutionary Fidel Castro and his newly established communist Cuban government. Thousands took to the streets and marched towards the Canal Zone in what would be called the Marches of Hunger and Desperation. All of this agitation worried Washington, and fearing a similar situation to what had happened in Egypt, they set about strategically stamping out calls for reform. Canal Zone police and U.S. military were instructed to fire upon civilians, killing tens, if not hundreds, in the so-called flag riots. It was during this period of agitation that Panama held its 1968 presidential election. The winner was a man named Arnulfo Arias, a moderate populist who won on a ticket of social change and broad support base from a variety of groups. His critical error was in trying to depose certain senior military officials, for which he himself was removed from power. The coup was led by a general named Omar Torrijos, and by 1969 he had successfully muscled out all of his fellow co-conspirators and took full control of government. By his side was a loyal army officer named Manuel Noriega. He'll come back later. Torrijos' rise to power changed the status quo of U.S.-Panama relations in a number of ways. Firstly, he was a fervent nationalist, intent on expanding Panama's power and influence. Secondly, as dictator, he had final say over any and all negotiations regarding the Panama Canal. Thirdly, according to historian Michael L. Conniff, basically, Torrijos was an inspired improviser, with a great capacity for booze and small talk, with little stomach for day-to-day administration. He was willing to shake up the country and its government, step on elite toes, bluff the gringos, and above all, spend money freely. Given some of his anti-communist actions in the past, Torrijos presided over a surprisingly socialist-leaning government. He became fast friends and allies with Fidel Castro of Communist Cuba, as well as appointing a notedly pro-union Minister of Labor. In 1973, Torrijos both petitioned for and was granted an opportunity to speak in front of the UN Security Council, arguing for a renegotiation of the I-Banao-Varia Treaty. Negotiations would eventually conclude with the election of President Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter was one of the first and only American presidents who expressed a genuine concern for the people of Panama. On the campaign trail, Carter wrote, "Relations with Panama ought to be viewed with an eye toward increasing Panama's role in and profits from canal operations." Despite threats from Torrijos that if the U.S. did not accept a renegotiated treaty, quote, his troops would have invaded and attacked the canal the next day, end quote, in 1978, for the first time in its history, Panama was given partial sovereignty over the Panama Canal. Following the death of Omar Torrijos in 1981, power effectively went to someone whom the dictator had coyly referred to as his gangster. The leader of the Panamanian Defense Force and Torrijos' right-hand man, Manuel Noriega, became the sole dictator of Panama. At around the same time, for a variety of reasons, Colombia had become the world's leading supplier of cocaine. Pablo Escobar and his Medellin cartel produced hundreds of thousands of kilograms of cocaine, most of which ended up in U.S. cities like New York, Los Angeles, and Miami. It was widely known to both U.S. officials and the people of Panama that Noriega was actively involved in the drug trade. According to historian Michael J. Conniff, quote, Noriega cooperated with the cartels to move some of its drugs to the United States when that market blossomed in the 1980s. Noriega also provided the important service of allowing cash from drug profits to be flown into Panama for deposit and laundering it in international banks. The money was then recycled through the State Bank of Panama. Noriega's gun running, money laundering, and drug smuggling were tolerated by the United States in the mid 1980s because of other services he performed. This begs the question, why, in the middle of its supposed war on drugs, would the US actively support someone they knew to be smuggling drugs? Well, for that, we have to get tangled in a web more complicated than anything previously mentioned. For a very brief synopsis, in 1984, the Reagan administration was embroiled in one of the most consequential scandals in modern history. The Iran-Contra affair, as it would be known, involved U.S. officials secretly facilitating the illegal sale of arms to revolutionary groups in Iran, using the profits from the sales to bankroll anti-communist revolutionaries in Nicaragua. After the scandal went public, the Reagan administration was forced to find new ways to bankroll the Contras in Nicaragua and continue its war on communism. It was here that Noriega's services would prove useful to the U.S. Now, this is where I must include a very large asterisk on the claims I am about to make, because upon the date of writing this script, these claims are still yet unproven. So, with that caveat, let's tell the tale of the conspiracy theory that may have turned out to be true. In 1998, journalist Gary Webb of the San Jose Mercury News published a three-part investigation into CIA dealings with the Contras. According to Webb, during the 1980s, the CIA bankrolled certain Contras supporters and fundraisers known to the U.S. to be cocaine smugglers. U.S. kingpin Ricky Freeway Ross was allegedly given between 10 and 15 kilograms of cocaine per week from CIA-backed Contra smugglers. Webb alleges the CIA supported the Contras supplying Ross with the cocaine. Meanwhile, the U.S. Justice Department and its agencies, who were aware of the drug trafficking operations linked to the Contras, derailed local police investigations and blocked the prosecution of Contra-linked cocaine traffickers. In effect, the U.S. was sponsoring and facilitating its own crack cocaine epidemic in order to fund anti-socialist movements in Latin America. Returning to our historian Michael J. Conniff, the Reagan administration had launched a campaign against drugs in the 1980s. About that time, U.S. officials gained irrefutable proof of Noriega's participation in the drug trade. Yet, they decided to use Noriega and his contacts in the region because he could keep the Contra campaign alive. All of this occurred, meanwhile thousands of Panamanians took to the streets to show their dissatisfaction with the dictator. Noriega's totalitarian regime censored the press, violently stamped out political opposition, and illegally detained, tortured, and murdered tens of thousands of innocent people. Noriega sold off valuable swaths of land for foreign interests, enriched himself and his political allies at the expense of his country, and brutally butchered his people on an unimaginable scale. Eventually, public criticism and the U.S.'s own frustration with their strongman all but forced the U.S. to depose the ruler that they had worked so closely with. Noriega did not go quietly, however. His regime was largely unaffected by U.S. and international economic sanctions, as well as the continued public demonstrations of native Panamanians. Following a failed U.S.-sponsored coup attempt in 1989, Noriega declared that through constant psychological and military harassment, the U.S. had created a state of war in Panama. And with that declaration, the U.S. initiated Operation Just Cause. Some 25,000 U.S. soldiers poured into the relatively tiny country, and within a few months, Noriega and his supporters had been driven out. Critics at the time lambasted the Bush administration for its handling of the situation, one even writing, "I don't see that devastating a small country's economy, then mounting a 25,000-man invasion which kills more than 300 people and wounds hundreds more, to seize a disreputable but unimportant military adventurer over whom American courts have disputed jurisdiction should be considered a success." It's actually here in our story, with the overthrow of Noriega, that I'm going to stop. You see, my mother grew up in Nicaragua during the 1970s, and her family often moved between Panama and Nicaragua. It was during this time that my mom and her family were forced into exile. Because of the constant warfare and political upheaval, many members of my family witnessed firsthand the atrocities perpetrated by U.S.-backed officials in Panama. U.S. support and eventual overthrow of the Noriega regime is the reason that my mom and her family came to the U.S. in search of better opportunities. Thankfully, my mother and her family had the means to enter the U.S. legally as asylum seekers. However, my thoughts go out to the thousands of Panamanians who have lacked such privileges. The countless people who were forced to flee their homes, abandon their families and loved ones, and go off in search of better opportunities. In conclusion, the tragic history of Panama is invariably characterized by its exploitative relationship with the U.S. From its very inception, the U.S. became involved in Panama for the sole purpose of promoting its own economic interests. Despite what American leaders may purport, the U.S.'s main export is not, nor has it ever been, democracy, self-determination, or freedom. For the people of Panama, this is the reason we cannot go back to our own country. Thank you.